We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
G'day and welcome to another episode of the Mankind Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Clift. Now, if you've listened to the show for any length of time, over the past 130 episodes, we have spent a remarkable amount of time, energy, and resources finding and inviting experts in the fields of psychology surrounding manhood and masculinity to share with you the data, the research, the history as to why men have such a difficult time expressing their emotions. Whether it's Paul Kivel's Man Box, where we talk about how we have policed each other into these narrow definitions of manhood, or whether it's actually something more biological that causes men to have a little bit less access to their hearts and their emotions, we've covered a lot of territory here, yet the work isn't done, and is exactly why I wanted to bring on David Brzozowski from TalentSmart EQ. Now, David is the director of training at TalentSmart, and a big part of why I wanted to hear from David and hear his story is the fact that, unlike many of his peers and colleagues, he doesn't have PhD next to his name. He doesn't come from a background in psychology, sociology, neuroscience, yet he is proof that emotional intelligence and developing it for ourselves is accessible to all of us. Now, you will relate to his story, I'm sure, in many ways, that growing up in a conservative household or environment is the perfect formula for repression of emotions. Because guess what? Real men don't show their feelings, don't express their emotions. Is that familiar? It's familiar for a lot of us, because that's what society has tried to do and police men into those narrow definitions. And so through David's story, you're going to hear how his journey has led him to a remarkable ability to connect with himself and others through emotional intelligence, and proof that you don't need to be psychoanalyzed or Jungian analyzed for your entire life to have a better understanding of who you are and the person in the mirror. EQ, emotional intelligence, is accessible to all of us, and we all have the ability to develop those skills. So I want to invite you into this conversation with David Brzozowski from TalentSmart to get a better understanding of how you yourself can liberate your heart and allow your emotions to freely express through emotional intelligence. Enjoy. Okay, g'day and welcome to another episode of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there is more than one way to be a man. And we are live. David, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Brandon. I'm excited to be here and chat with you.
Mate, this has been something I've really been looking forward to since we had this scheduled about a month ago.
Yeah.
And I want to kick things off. So you've traveled the world teaching emotional intelligence for the past couple of years. I'm curious, what have you noticed, if at all, the difference or contrast between receptiveness between men and women?
Yeah, interesting question. I love that. I would say that at first there is a difference because I find that men might be a little less receptive to want to talk about emotions, whereas women maybe right away out of the gate are more than willing to. But I think that what happens organically is when it's a safe space to talk about emotions, and not just emotions from, like I always joke that this isn't about bringing a box of Kleenex that we're all going to start crying about our emotions, but talking about what they do for us and how they sometimes get in our way, but how they sometimes also help us. It opens that safe space, and the conversations really become, for me, what I've experienced, so much more across the board. And I've seen less and less with men being unwilling to have the conversation about emotional intelligence than when they start out with. Now, it is interesting sometimes, Brandon, that whenever I have a room full of almost all men, it takes a little longer to break through that. But once we get there, I think that men especially, are finding this is a safe space to not talk about, the uncomfortable part of emotions, but just to start understanding that we all have them, and they can be a benefit to us and also not so much a benefit whenever they get in our way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, yeah, you kind of see those layers perhaps start to pull away the more
Yeah.
time you spend. The arms are crossed and they might start to loosen and drop. And you see people checking their six, like, who's seeing me right now?
Right. Yeah.
I think there's much to be said about that, because you have a professional context more often than not that you're having this conversation with these folks. And especially, I would say, men have a greater challenge in opening up to their emotions, particularly because society has told them that it's not okay.
100%. 100%.
Was that your experience growing up?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I grew up in a very conservative household in a conservative area. And, it was not okay to really even talk about emotions, and let alone express them, by the way.
Sure.
So, as the oldest child,
Right.
that also gave me a little bit of extra. Like, I had to be the one who was like, oh, it's not okay to cry or to have this. So, and I think that is, like you said, that's kind of what society has put upon men a lot of the times is, no, we've got to hold ours in, or we've got to pretend that they don't exist.
Bingo.
And I think as we have evolved in a society, now that we're in 2023, pushing 2024, people, men especially, are starting to realize it's okay for me to acknowledge my emotions. But when I was growing up, that was not necessarily the case. I'm a little older than you are. And so I didn't really get to even see, I think, an example of what it would look like to express my emotions in a healthy way. So instead, I probably kept them in more than I needed to. But then when they did come out, I can be an emotional person. I'm Polish and Italian. So when you grow up in those both families, there's lots of emotion. Trust me.
You're breaking your mother's heart, David.
That's right. I love that you could do the Italian accent with the Australian accent. That's kind of perfect.
Hey, we come from we're a very multicultural nation down in Australia. So you've got quite a lengthy experience in learning and development, about 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, or longer. And you came into TalentSmart, and just to kind of give background, TalentSmart EQ, in my mind, personally, is, to me, the Rosetta Stone of emotional intelligence. I believe it's one of the more accessible resources in how to learn about EQ and how to develop emotional intelligence. Yet you came into the company without the same background as many of the other experts involved, right? Many of them have PhD next to their name in psychology, sociology, neuroscience, yet you didn't. So what was it? Do you give yourself like your own credence and credit? What was it about you that caught their attention? And what was it about this particular area that got you so excited?
Yeah. And that's a great acknowledgement to say that, because I think what it also says is you don't have to have what the experts who have developed EQ to be able to talk about it, right? And so, for me, I think it was Dr. Jane Greaves, who is one of the founders of our company, co-author of several books, and she, I think, really was the person who saw in me that I came from a different perspective. I came from the corporate world, but also just in the real world, lots of background besides learning and development, that gave me a lot of just real world experience that I was able to connect the dots of EQ. I had read the Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book prior to me coming here. So I had not just an intrigue, but I was already personally using it.
Sure.
And me being able to just connect what it's like in real life and not have an academic approach to it has been, I think, my forte. Like, I'm the person who, in a one-on-one conversation, so whether I'm doing executive coaching or if I'm traveling the world, being in front of classes, I understand the academic part of it and all the research and the studies, but where I apply it far more is just how everyday life really needs emotional intelligence to be at the forefront of that. So that conversation for me is probably different than maybe some of my peers and some of the other people who are in the world of EQ as well.
So it's interesting you bring that up, because that's actually how I got my job at the university, not being a professor, because when they were looking at bringing in emotional intelligence to the curriculum, they were like, well, do we know anyone that has experience in this? And a friend of mine was in their marketing department and said, you've got to meet Brandon, just because my background with men's work and helping men get access to their emotions, know that it's actually safe to work through your emotions as long as you have, I mean, we can go into the kind of framework of EQ, but the self-awareness and the ability to self-manage those emotions is, I think, one thing that separates a lot of men who enjoy a lot more success in life than those who perhaps are hitting a couple ceilings in their development, their relationships. But they wanted me to come in specifically because I was a bridge. I'm a self-professed layman. Even in this stuff, we've done 128 episodes of this podcast. I would not call myself an expert in manhood and masculinity research and studies. I'm not. I interview those people.
Right.
Because, and it sounds like you're very much in the same boat, you have an ability to bridge the gap between this phenomenal research, remove some of the jargon, inside language, complex data, and relate it to real life examples where someone can go, oh, from where I'm at in my life, I get what that means now.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a great way of making it more accessible to people.
Accessible. Yes.
Right. Like that makes people say, okay, I'm willing to listen to something that you can take tell me how this came about, right? Tell me if there's research and studies behind this that back this. But now let's talk about it in real life. And that has been my biggest successes when I do this. Yesterday was my 3-year anniversary with TalentSmart. And so I've been doing it for 3 years, only emotional intelligence. And I have continued to learn that the more realistic and accessible I become for people, they're willing to want to kind of push for themselves to say, oh, let me dig a little bit deeper. I mean, I've had many a man in a class come to tears when they have an aha moment about where emotions were affecting them, and they had no idea that that's what it was. Wow. And I think that that's powerful because you have to have the safe zone to do that. And so that's where that becomes just super powerful. And at TalentSmart, by the way, we call emotions or emotional intelligence a power skill rather than a soft skill, because I hate that term.
Thank you.
Soft skill is nothing soft about emotional intelligence. So.
No. And I love that you bring up accessibility. That's part of my notes here because, it's proven now that one's IQ is predetermined at birth. Yeah. There's really not a lot you can do to shift or change that number. Maybe dedicate 10 years of your life studying the encyclopedia every edition, and you might move at one point. Yet emotional intelligence, there's really a sliding scale here on multiple fronts that you can actively see results every single day, which I love. I've done TalentSmart's assessment, I think 4 times now, and it's been amazing to see the progression and where I've actually slid back a little, where maybe ego or hubris or whatever has kicked in a little bit, gotten a little complacent and lazy, and those muscles start to atrophy a little bit. So what insights have you gained? Because you've read the book, so you weren't unaware of the importance and the power of emotional intelligence. Right. How has your journey now been over the past 3 years, and where have you seen significant changes in your life?
Yeah, I will say that for me, I always knew that. So the self-management, there's 4 different skills of emotional intelligence, and self-management I think I knew that was one of my challenges, but until I really started facilitating programs and having discussions and coaching sessions, that I realized how much that was an area that I needed to get a hold of, because I can definitely have emotions that get the better of me sometimes. And what it was happening is it was coming out of me and causing me to say things and do things that I later regretted. We all kind of have that moment where you're in a very emotional state and you say something and you're like, oh, wow, that was not supposed to come out of my mouth.
Just catch the words as they leave.
Absolutely. And so for me, that's been the biggest part of my personal journey is getting a grasp on how I self-manage.
Sure.
I am so much better than I was 3 years ago, to the point now where, and we often do our assessments here at TalentSmart just to kind of see how our journey is going along. And for the longest time, self-management continued to be my lowest. Now, my scores sometimes rose, and I saw the behaviors changing. But finally, this summer, my self-management became not my lowest score. And I started noticing I no longer really had to think about some of the things that to kind of hold me back. I just do them naturally. And that's the beauty of, like you said, Brandon, this is something as a skill that you can actually work on for yourself. So it's not just a given thing like IQ. I mean, it is something that if I want to get a hold of my self-management, there's certain things I can certainly do for that. And they're worth it if you find that it's getting in your way.
Absolutely. So maybe we take a moment just to kind of zoom out and give the listeners maybe a visual in their mind of the different skills. Because the different areas of research around EQ have different kind of models.
Yeah, that's true.
But there's 4 skills that have kind of 2 different dimensions to them. Are you able to give us an insight just so we can kind of see what those 4 skills are?
Yeah, like from a high level. So there's 2 are the personal competences, and those are really about yourself. It's your self-awareness and then your self-management. So it's what am I aware about my emotions? And then once I'm aware, what do I do with them? So the management piece, which is that action piece.
Right. So I'm driving down the freeway. Someone cuts me off. They're texting on their phone. I feel anger coming up inside of me. I feel the desire to say a couple 4-letter words. That's the awareness, right?
Right. Exactly.
And then the management is take a breath, do some box breathing. You know, maybe they're in a rush. Maybe they have somewhere they need to be. Maybe they kick kittens in their spare time. I don't know. Right.
Right. Whatever it is. Yeah. It's making sure you don't do something stupid like try and cut them off. Or, have your window down and start screaming at them. And then you have this potential, argument. So that's the piece, exactly like you said, with self-management is what do I hold myself back from doing that could not work out for me, not be as effective for me, right?
Yeah. Bingo.
And then the other 2 are from the social competence, which is social awareness. So that's us actually trying to understand other people's emotions, not controlling them, but just trying to understand where are they coming from, which leads you into relationship management. And that's about how I manage myself within a relationship. And so it's the 2 different components of personal and social all together. And they all interplay with each other. One usually informs the other. But the nice thing about it is that they're skills and I can work on them. I can improve them. I can make them become my friend, if you will.
Yeah. And I enjoy the platform because it gives, TalentSmart has licenses to various films, right? Aaron Brockovich being one of them. And and you can see examples of how it turns up and go, oh man, I've done that, or I can relate to that. And then active skills that these players could have used in those situations. And back to kind of the social skills, that an example for those listening for me is always, how well can you read a room?
Yeah.
How well can you get the pulse of a room and the energy? I mean, I teach night classes. So these are people that have been up since 5 a.m. and it's 8 o'clock and I'm teaching something perhaps very dry. And so with that awareness, all right, let's get on our feet. Let's move around. Let's, give each other a high five, whatever, just to get energy moving. But then the relationship management is far more multi-dimensional and it requires all 3, all 3 combined, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you really explained that nicely because it is about, I think that's kind of great that they probably have you as the evening teacher because many people might just be like, listen, you signed up for this class.
Bueller.
Deal with it. Yeah, absolutely. But if you're aware that these individuals may have just gotten done working for 8 or 9 hours after getting up early, it does become incumbent upon us to figure out, well, what do I do to engage them more? And, can I do something? So that's the beauty of it is that you have control over that because you can decide what to do with that.
Well, Matt, I love that you bring all of these skills to a relatable, easily digestible approach because you probably have learnt this in your experience. And I have this conversation with a lot of academics who come on the show and they'll all say too, there's this like intellectual insecurity that when, your paper is getting reviewed by all these players and they're very keen to cut each other down and poke holes and all the rest. It's so easy to keep this stuff close to the chest. Right. Whereas if someone can demonstrate examples where like, here's where I messed up in this skill in the past, or you can make it relatable and invite people in. I remember first class I ever taught for UTC was a room full of tradesmen with mud on their boots and one woman and 13 of them. And it's emotional intelligence, the first class. I mean, you threw me to the wolves.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Every one of them has their arms crossed and I'm going, wow, this will be fun. Let's see. Who thinks emotions get in the way?
Right.
Show of hands. All right. Who thinks they're a nuisance? Show of hands. Who thinks irrational behavior is costing money and productivity on the job site? Hands go up. Who's seen The Lion King? Hands go up. Keep it up if you cried when Mufasa died. And hands go up and down. Everyone's looking left and right. And I was like, I got you, I got you, I got you, I got you.
Yeah, yeah.
We all have emotions, right? We just have certain experiences in life that taught us whether or not it was safe to share them or show them.
True.
So,
well, and I think that's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's a big aha moment for people in a class, and especially for men, by the way, that when you ask them about what they've done with their emotions that were getting them riled up during the day or whatever that is, it's the first inclination is for them to say, I just pushed them down. But I always ask, well, where have they gone? Because they're in our body somewhere. We have made them go somewhere, but they don't just kind of evaporate into thin air. And that is when you take people down a journey and say, kind of like what you said before about the you're driving home. Did it come out then? Yeah. Or did it actually come home when you walk in the house and perhaps your wife is waiting for you at home and she says, how was your day, honey? And you snap at her because you still haven't dealt with the emotions from earlier. And that poor person who is happy to see you is the one who's now having the emotions come on it. And often I see people's reactions saying, yeah, that's exactly it. And so I think that's the revelation that people need to understand is we can't get, if you're a human being, you have emotions. Yes. So we have to just know that sometimes we are not managing them as effectively as we really could.
Sure. And I think, what do you think about a distinction, right? Because there's often a dissonance when it comes to presenting this information to someone who perhaps is a bit more introverted, a little bit more take it on the chin. How often is that misconstrued or misunderstood as emotional management?
Oh, absolutely. And I actually have people who are introverts clarify that they have just as many emotions as extroverts do, but sometimes they are misunderstood because of the fact that it looks like, oh, wow, you really were able to manage your emotions. And I've had many people say, no, I'm still processing. Yeah. And it might just take me a little longer to process that. And then it comes out a little bit later. It's just a different journey is the difference. Extroverts might let it go right away, right? But that's where you have to figure out how to manage it. Sure. But we're still all having those same feelings along the way.
Bingo. Yeah, a phrase we use in the Mankind Project is that which we hide, repress, and deny. Right? These emotions that we hide, repress, and deny, often we don't want to deal with them. It's inconvenient when these emotions come up. So how can I distract myself? Is that with pornography? Is that with alcohol? Is that with mindlessly scrolling social media? Is that with Netflix? Right? It's this numbing. It's this turning off, because perhaps any time in the past where I or anyone might have shown their emotions, there were repercussions for that. Right? Yeah. There was a demonizing for doing such a thing. But at the end of the day, if these emotions aren't processed, imagine holding a beach ball underwater. It's coming up eventually. Do you want that to be at Thanksgiving? Do you want that to be in the middle of court proceedings during a divorce? Do you want that to be after a couple drinks? The next thing you know, a glass is getting pushed in someone's face. Like, these things come out, and you see that when dudes get drunk and it's like, I love you, man. You know, all of a sudden it goes from, hey, you don't say that to your guy friends to, I love you, bro. I love you so much. And tears are falling. Right? If we can destigmatize conversations around this stuff, I think we'd have a lot less people taking out their junk on everyone else.
That's a great way of putting that, Brent. I mean, I think that is the challenge for people who feel like it's not okay to even explore what's going on with the emotions, right? I mean, because that's the question. I mean, that's the self-awareness part of EQ, right? Is to ask, why am I even having this? So we talk about all the time that we say, try not to call your emotions as good or bad. They might feel good or bad. Yes. Because then if you use that as a data point to ask yourself, why on earth is every time Brandon's in a meeting with me or in a social setting with me, he triggers me? Like, I need to figure out, and I'm sure you never do that to people, but it is a place for me to figure out what is it that is about Brandon that's making me feel that way, because eventually I might come to fisticuffs with Brandon because I haven't even figured out what some of that is.
Yeah. And it's your stuff. It's your story.
That's it.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Projections are just, I spot it because I got it. It's inherently something you're doing. Even the nose on your face may remind me of a bully I had in high school. And you may have done nothing wrong to me, but there is something that is creating dissonance and an inability for me to connect with you. So I got to do my work. I got to get clear on what that is, knowing that it isn't about you.
Yeah.
Right. It is
that's
about
so
me.
Rich. That's so true. And that's a scary place to go, right?
100%, because it requires you to go back.
Yeah.
It requires you to go back. So I want to go back into your story. So you grew up in a traditionally more conservative household, oldest of how many?
4.
4. So I imagine man of the household kind of narrative was coming in. Was taking care of your siblings part of your responsibility being the oldest?
I mean, as I got a little older, watching them whenever my parents were maybe going out for the night when probably I was a little too young to do that. But that's kind of, back in the day, that's kind of safer and cheaper than getting a babysitter.
Yes.
But yeah, and so then you start taking on some of that, as the older sibling who is responsible. But yeah, all of that, and also kind of setting the pace, if you will, for what it's like to be the oldest of this family.
Right. So this leads to my question: who gave you, or when did you give yourself permission to feel and express?
Wow, that's a great. I feel like my therapist just walked in the door. Let me.
I don't pretend to be one on the internet. Let's make that clear.
That's right. No, that's a great question. I think for me, it probably happened along the way of finding my own self, becoming a little bit more authentic, of getting to college because I not only grew up in this small conservative town, but really didn't get out of it very often. I mean, so it wasn't even like I had a view of a whole lot of other. When I went to college, was the first time that I was kind of getting out of this rather conservative area.
Echo chamber.
I would say, yeah. In college, I think it was starting to come out because I was seeing different things, and I think for myself, I didn't know what was coming out of me because they were probably emotions that like I had maybe felt before, but had not really expressed a whole lot of as I was getting older. But I would say probably the very first time was probably as I moved away from Pittsburgh shortly after college and explored a whole new life. And that's when I started realizing that becoming yourself also means finding your emotional place too, being able to understand what makes you tick and why so kind of all the things that probably are emotional intelligence that I didn't know about emotional intelligence back then. Right.
Sure. So you got the heck out of Dodge and was able to see that there was a different way of thinking, a different way of believing. This is, and I don't always want to just bring this back to what we do at MKP, but I think that's why it's important that a lot of these lessons are done in group settings, to know that it is impossible to walk in anyone else's shoes.
Yeah.
All of our lived experiences, the nature and nurture that got us to where we are is all unique and different. And that how I perceive an instance, right? We could all be standing in a room and see something happen. Each of us may have a different story of how that went down. So you were seeing different forms of expression that may not have been reflected within the county lines that you grew up in, to then go, oh, wow, like we're not in Kansas anymore. There are more ways to think and feel. And so the same way that I would talk to anyone here in our county to like, before you make judgments on the rest of the world and how they should live and breathe, go travel. Get outside your white picket fence and go see how the rest of the world lives before you start making black and white assumptions or judgments of how things should be. And I think emotionally that applies as well, to go, I might consider anger as a bad emotion. You might consider it a hot emotion. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, you just described social awareness so well. It's about trying to get out there and understand, why do people think differently than me? Why do people why are they having an emotion about something that I don't have the same? And it's because we all tick differently. You said something I think really key about stepping into other people's shoes. I think there's a little bit of a misnomer from people. It's not about trying to step into people's shoes to agree with them. It's trying to understand where they come from so that you have a better relationship, And so I often have maybe stepped into somebody's shoes and been like, oh, wow, now that makes sense as to why you think that way. I still don't agree, but I
Bingo.
at least now understand where you're coming from. And we don't do that a lot.
No.
Men especially don't do that, by the way, as much as we should, because I think that would just make us all a little bit more tolerable of where we're coming from.
I'm almost not surprised now hearing your story that you ended up getting into singing and acting and comedy. Right. That it was like, I mean, this has been my experience when I finally gave myself permission to feel. Yeah. I went to an all boys private school, and I thank my parents every day for the work they put in to put me in that school, and great friends, great connections. But there was a humongous stigma around emotion. And I personally believe that certain people are born with perhaps a little more access to their emotions than others, just out of wiring. Doesn't mean that because I'm naturally akin to it, doesn't mean I don't have to do the work. Right. And just because someone might be more logical doesn't mean they shouldn't do it either. But I had these emotions, and they would come out. And every time it would compound the bullying. It would compound the hit to the stomach. It would compound these things. And so I just shut that stuff down. And I said this to my men's group 8 years ago, when I first sit in a men's group, I feel like I'm breathing through a straw. Just such little life-giving oxygen was coming through, because there was this persona, this mask, this image that had to be upheld. And when you work with men, and I'm sure you work with some pretty powerful men and women, right?
Yep,
you do executive coaching. What are the battles like, the internal battles as you teach this stuff? What have you witnessed? What have been some of the ahas?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because of the fact that it relates back to exactly what you just said. It's like, was I maybe not given permission beforehand to kind of express or what I was feeling? Because we were feeling them. We just weren't really doing anything with them or letting it. So what I have found, especially with some top executives, is they're still stuck in a place of it's going to show weakness. If I, not necessarily, and it's not about like somebody was planning to cry, but it was the ability, if I even express that I'm having an emotion that is anything but stern and stoic,
assertive,
that I'm going to be judged. And I think that we're breaking that stereotype down a little bit, but there still are people, especially if they come from that area in their life, meaning like earlier on. And if we never got to the place where we permitted ourselves to have those feelings, then here we are now, fast forward into our career, maybe running a large $1 billion company, and I'm still not dealing with some of the emotions that are even happening now. Because let's face it, running big companies, there's a lot of emotions that go on with that too. And to not have that, some of the best CEOs I've worked for have been people who were willing to show that they had some sort of emotional reaction to something, because you see them more as human.
Bingo. Yes. You see them more as human. And I wouldn't, thank Brene Brown's cotton socks. I mean, seriously, yes. The impact and the ripples that woman has created in this world is just phenomenal. And it really is true that vulnerability is strength, right? But there is a distinction between, and I think this is what most people misunderstand when they're going into an emotional intelligence training. They confuse vulnerability as, what's the word I'm looking for? Broadcasting. Yeah. It's like, I'm going to just air my dirty laundry for everyone to see, and they can manipulate me once they have this private information about me. And sure, when you first start learning these tools, like, it's going to be tough. It's like a fire hose. And especially if you're taking the lid off something that you may have put on when you were 4. So get a therapist. Get a therapist, counseling, whatever. Like, it's important to take on these journeys with guidance, but to know that true vulnerability is sharing this stuff with who are the 6 people that are going to carry your coffin, right? Who are your confidants? And it sounds like what you're saying, these executives that show and share their emotions, they're able to do it once they've gone through the skills.
I agree. And because it makes them even more authentic for not just others, but for themselves. I mean, because when you start realizing this is really who I am, And I do have emotions, but I'm going to own them, and I'm not going to be embarrassed by them. It's going to make me more powerful in a way that shares that I'm willing to share these emotions about this, and here's what we're doing with them. It's not an excuse. It's just who we are.
Yeah.
And I think what it does, especially in companies that have leaders like that, it allows the rest of the organization and people who report into them to see it's okay to be a real human even at work, and not have to say, well, we cannot have any emotional reactions to things here, because it's unrealistic to do that.
Very unrealistic. Very unrealistic. So Boyson Hodgson, my co-host and dear friend, just checked in on our Facebook Live. Brandon triggers me all the time. Ha. I do. Especially when he gets a text from me at 9:30, and Boyson, have a million ideas of what we should do, and we need to get David on the show. So
There you go.
So we're heading into the holiday season, and I know some of us are excited about that, and I'm sure there are many of us listening that, here we go. Or I'm about to hear from my drunk racist uncle talk about how Jewish space lasers are blah, blah, blah. Like,
Yep.
It's getting into trigger season. These skills, I mean, obviously the context in which you're often hired is from a professional lens to work with companies, but these skills are agnostic, right? So
true.
how can we bring some of these in, or at least have some awareness as we lead into the holiday season and getting back together with family?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because it is the prime time, and this is not just for work. I mean, I use EQ probably more at home in my personal life than I do at work, because you have so many different people usually in your life, and you can't treat them all the same way. And so, just to your point, at the holidays, sometimes we see people only at the holidays. And you might be thinking to yourself, maybe they'll bail out this year. Maybe they won't actually come to Thanksgiving dinner, and I'm going to have to pretend to have a conversation. Yeah. So what I find emotional intelligence allows you to do, set yourself up for success. Like, what am I aware of that might make me have a trigger emotional reaction, right? It could be Uncle Sam or whatever that is. But being prepared about what to do with it. Because often we say, well, I can't do anything about them. You are correct. I can't do anything about them, but I can do something about my reaction. So I'm able to maybe say, as soon as I see Uncle Sam having his third glass of wine, I know it's time to cut ties with the conversation and move to somebody else in the family, right? Like, don't put yourself in the situation that you're going to leave and say how mad you were when you are the one that stayed there. So it's little things like that can be powerful to get through the holidays. Where are you going that you know is going to give you some sort of an emotional reaction? Who is it that might be doing that? Is it a situation? Is it a person? And be very planful, ahead of time. That's like self-management in a nutshell. But you're using all the other skills to be able to remind yourself of who are at those events. I mean, I have a holiday party every year, and sometimes it's the only time I see a few people because of just how busy life is. You connect with them, whether it's texting or, here and there. But I know that there are sometimes I'm like, I have to invite, oh gosh, I hope they're not listening right now, but I have to invite them because it's the thing to do, right? It's the right thing to do.
Yes.
And then I think, okay, so I'm going to make sure I do my hosting duties, which is to have that conversation. And then I will hightail it to the other room and hope they have a good time with everybody else.
Yeah. My wife and I give each other cues. We've given each other permission to kind of like draw a circle on the back or something. I
love that, Brandon.
Because to be able to look outside for myself and be like, oh, wow, I'm totally controlling the conversation right now. Or, oh, wow, like I yanked a thread I shouldn't have, and now the whole bloody thing's, fallen down. Oh, Uncle Jim just took the tin foil the turkey was cooked in and turned it into a hat. And it's and we're starting to get into conspiracy territory. And it's like, Brandon, don't pull that thread. And I'm like, thank you. Yeah. Because I myself, at 30 years old, wants to yank that thread. So I feel justified in going there and throwing my EQ skills out the door because I'm justified, dagnabbit. It comes back to something I share with students is I'm standing up here with access to information that you may not have. Yeah. Just because I am doesn't mean I have a black belt. in this stuff.
Love them. Yeah.
I don't. And if I ever claim to have one, you've come to the wrong place.
Yeah.
You've come to the wrong teacher.
You just said something so key. Is like having those feelings, like I want to yank that thing off of his head. That's all fine, right? Like that allows you to say to yourself, that really is pissing me off or making me angry or whatever. But it's then making sure that you have something in place that you don't go and do that, right? Like the healthy thing is acknowledge that I'm having this thing and go over and like maybe for you, you grab your wife and you say, all right, we need to go out here for 5 minutes and talk about the moron that's over there doing this. And then you get it out of your system and then you come back and then you don't go and grab it on. That's the reality of like what sometimes we forget to do is like, it's natural for me to have that reaction. Yeah. And so be careful that you don't then go and do the thing that you're like, I shouldn't grab that off his head and throw it at him. Right.
Totally. And I think it's after the fact, the victory feels much more sweet for the punch that isn't thrown. Use that as a metaphor. Right.
So true. I love that. That's very true. Yeah.
It's like,
it's almost like you got proud of yourself, right?
Leveled up. Whereas otherwise, what's at risk? What's at risk if I do? What's at risk if I don't? Weigh the two options. And generally after the fact, gratitude for not yanking said thread. David, I want to ask, please go.
Well, I was just going to say that reminded me of a situation. So I was doing a group of people down in Texas about a month ago. And there was a gentleman, I mean, I'm talking about 10-gallon hat on, like the big belt buckle and the work boots and everything. And I was like, well, this is going to be a tough dude to get through, right? And didn't talk a lot, but he did bring something exactly. He said, you know what? I am more proud when I don't do what people think I should do, which is hit somebody and I walk away from that and saying, this is how a man should act. And I was like, that's probably when he said that in front of this group of people, I saw the reactions of like, wow, that is a great way to look at your own emotional intelligence, is to say, how do I show up the way that I'm going to be proud?
That is masculinity in its finest form right there. That is masculinity, not throwing the punch. Because we've been given role models since Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson. And before that, through like World War II media and all the rest, is like the hard man. They don't sort things with their words. They sort it with their fists, and they take care of business. And how's that working for you? How's that working for you being in the slammer on a Saturday night when you could be with your family after you got drunk and hooked someone, right?
Yeah.
And so I love that you share that example. And I think that's a good check for me, because I'm a judgmental person at the end of the day. I'm naive to ever say that I'm not, because I think that's part of the brain that sorts things. And I had a good friend of mine who I met through my wife. When I met him, dip spitting, Harley riding, like just a tough country dude. Right. And I made every assumption under the moon about this guy.
Yeah.
And he proved that wrong time and time again. Yeah. And even the assumption that because his dad, being from a previous generation, mustn't have been like him. No, his dad, who was probably born in the 50s, is also emotional and was loving and caring. Yeah. And it helps me check myself to go, I walked into a room full of 13 tradesmen, but that story that I had in my mind isn't true in every case, in every example. Right. And how can I give them the benefit of the doubt? Curiosity, inquiry, leaning in, right? Not hiding behind these skills, using these skills to inquire. And I'm sure you've probably found that working with executives that are in charge of billions of dollars and thousands of employees. I'm sure you get surprised.
Well, and that's exactly, I mean, again, I hate to keep kind of quoting the definition, but you're right, spot on with social awareness, being curious. It's like everybody that's dressed the same way doesn't mean that they are the same way inside. And so just because somebody's work is, like you said, with like the gentleman that I was talking about, I mean, like, plaid shirt, I mean, what you would picture in a country Western movie, right?
A lumberjack. He was a Marlboro man.
Deep voice and beard and mustache. And honestly, and I had that judgmental view at first, which is not a bad thing to have. I think as long as we're willing to be open-minded, to actually be curious, right?
Willing,
like,
yes.
I might allow myself to say, okay, what's that going to be like? And that's just such human nature. It's only scary whenever we stay there and don't let ourselves explore who the person really is. Because sometimes we're right? Sometimes we're kind of like, all right, well, but I can't do anything about that. But I can at least keep my mind open and curious about, like, how do I even reach those people in a way that's going to help them understand what we're talking about from their perspective, because I don't need them to hear it from my perspective. My perspective comes from my own experiences and life journey. And I need to be able to figure out, how do I hit them with theirs and, get them to look at it the same way that I've gotten to that journey.
Well, you know what we just did, David? We just spoke directly to many of the divides and lines that have been drawn in the sand socially today, whether that's political, racial, religious. Like, if we applied that same rationale and those same techniques to those who don't look like you or I, who have different orientation or different belief systems or different political ideologies, we can meet them where they are with curiosity, be courageous in our curiosity, and be clear on our intent in engaging. Man, like, that is emotional intelligence. And that's what I try and get across to people, whether effective or not, is this is a superpower. This is a superpower that we all have access to. It's just a muscle that has to be worked. Yeah. It has to be worked. And there has to be a degree of self-awareness. Is tough, because I have to be willing to look at the areas that I am lacking, that I am not turning up. I will go teach an emotional intelligence class and have the whole cohort standing on their desk saying, "Oh, captain, my captain," and then come home and explode on my why.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, you're so right. Emotional intelligence or self-awareness is probably the toughest, because it requires vulnerability, right? I have to be able to look into myself and say, what is it that gets me? What makes me emotional? What makes me feel this way? And we don't like that, because sometimes we find out answers that are like, well, what am I going to do about that now? Yeah. Right.
Or it confirms a fear that we don't want to admit. It
confirms a fear too. Absolutely. Yeah.
Like, I am behaving like my dad, or I am.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. Yeah. I mean, that's a constant thing I hear from people, even in any groups that I do the workshops for, is like, oh, wow, that's my mother, that's my father, that's my uncle. And it's like, but that's a learned behavior, right? I mean, like, that's who if you had some really good relationships, just because their behaviors were not what you wanted to replicate, you might be because that's who you were paying attention to.
Sure. Absolutely. That's the nature, right, of how we're raised. So for those that may be feeling hesitant to look into emotional intelligence, because you and I have spoken about how a lot of this relates to childhood traumas and ACEs and all these things that we've been through. To that person that's going, well, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole, what's your call to action to say, hey, the water's fine, like, come like, there's only good stuff to come from this, trust me.
Yeah, because not everybody's going to get the chance to maybe go through an emotional intelligence workshop.
Sure.
Your company may not be doing that. But I think it's self-development, right? I think that people, TalentSmart, we have some great books, but the one that I would always call it, not as a sales pitch, but EQ, Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book, is such an amazing book. It is written by the amazing Dr. Gene Greaves and Travis Bradbury, who have used data from the people who really did all the research and studying. And it's written, like, it's not written by people who are PhDs galore, right?
Yes.
Like, the way you can read this book,
it's accessible.
It's not front to back. Like, you can pop into it. Here's the other cool thing, is there is an assessment at the back of the book. So if I want to even see what my emotional intelligence is, and not tell anybody else, right? Like, this is just my own journey. I can take an assessment. I can get some feedback, some data, and I can then read the book and see how can I be a little bit more effective in what I do, especially if, anything that we've talked about, or as you continue talking the EQ journey, is you owe it to yourself to be able to figure out, what is it that's I'm not allowing myself to work on. And I think that this private journey could be really healthy, is to be able to, pick up the book and and see what you learn about yourself too. There's nothing better than self-development continuously through your life, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think that when you start to realize, oh wow, I can do something about that, that's even more powerful.
Yeah. It's empowering. Yeah. It's taking responsibility and going, I can't change what happened to me, but I can do work to reframe it and see how it happened for me,
Yeah.
and have some tools to move forward and do different, right? It's not always do better. It's just do different.
That's a great way of saying that, Brent. And continue listening to your podcast because you talk about this. And I think that hearing it from different angles is also healthy because maybe somebody isn't connecting with my journey, right? But there's other ways to hear it. And you might finally hear somebody say something that's like, oh, no, that makes sense to me.
Okay. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, man, this has just been so juicy. And I hope all of you that have been joining us live or those that are listening after the fact on the podcast are really feeling it too, because this is primo stuff. And we're so lucky to have you here, David. I got a final question, and it's a two-parter. So the first part is, what is your personal mission in this work? You know, it's I don't want the company mission, and maybe they're very similar, but what is your personal mission? And then I'm going to hand you a magic wand, and you'll get to wave it. What does the world look like once that mission is enacted?
Wow, that's some power you're giving me, Brandon. So I think my personal mission with this has been to be able to connect with people in the personal side of EQ, because most of the work that I do through TalentSmart is for corporations, for small companies, large companies, executives. But in every interaction I have, I'm hoping that the message is about what do I do with this in my personal life. I think that's missed sometimes in a class from work, because we assume that just because we're in a class of work or at college, that I must have to put this in my curriculum, right? This is about how do I make work better with this? But sometimes your first aha might be, how do I make my personal life better? Some of the best connections that I've made and walked away feeling full is whenever somebody says, I'll give you two examples. Last spring, I was doing a big group, and a woman at the end of it, whenever their leader said, what are some of your takeaways? And she stood up and she said, I think that he just may have saved my marriage. And it wasn't me, but it was EQ. She said, and she shared about, it was the thing that she was missing was she wasn't hearing, she wasn't listening, she wasn't putting herself into her husband's shoes to understand where he was coming from. She said, we have been through lots of therapy sessions, but this made me open my mind. And I thought, that's one of the most powerful reactions. It'd be great if your team at work were being more productive, but the fact that you think that your marriage may have just been solved, beautiful. And then I just got done doing a class with a group of people in a company a woman who is, and she shared with me that I could share this story because she had such an aha. She's going through breast cancer right now. She's still in the middle of going through surgery, making decisions. And she learned in her assessment report that her lowest of the four skills that her numbers came out with self-awareness. She says, I'm a very self-aware person. I'm confident. And she started reading some of how she answered her questions. And she realized power has been taken away from her because of her breast cancer. And what she didn't realize was that was affecting her, not just at work, but in her relationship with her husband and with her kids. As we were talking about it, we were having a side conversation. She just broke down, and I'm crying and she's crying. It was this emotional moment that she said, I need to get a hold of this. And so those personal journeys are, for me, far more important. I want you to get it. If work has paid for this, right?
Yes.
But that's the place where I feel like my journey is with what I've been doing the past 3 years. And I probably realized that piece for me was so important probably about 6 months to 9 months in, because I started seeing that connection in every aspect of life.
Wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So that's pretty cool, right? I mean,
oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, like you said, it's life-changing. I know that when my wife hit the 5-year mark after her thyroid was removed from her thyroid cancer, her story changed. I am not my cancer anymore. I am not my cancer.
Yeah.
Right? I am someone who who had cancer. It doesn't define me. It's the meaning I make of it. Right. Mm-hmm. And so this woman, through these tools, was able to gain the insights of, I need to make a new meaning of this cancer journey.
Exactly. Yeah, that was exactly it. Yeah.
Beautiful.
And so if I had the magic wand.
You have the magic wand. Here it is.
I do have it right now, right? I think that what I would hope for is that people take emotions more seriously and less seriously at the same time. Meaning that they realize that they're powerful, that they can sometimes take us over and not even realize it, and they make us do stupid things and say stupid things. But to also then step back sometimes in our own life to say, why am I doing that? Why does that bother me so much? Because sometimes when we really do ask those questions, we realize, oh, wow, that's not really worth it. It's like the famous saying of control what you can control. We often try and control everything that is out of our control, but we work so hard to control it. And sometimes when you step back, you realize that emotion is unnecessary for me to continue to have, but it's what do I do with it, right? Like, it's not push it down. It's why am I having that? And now what can I do about it? Because I do think that the world, but especially here in our great country of the USA, we might also get along better.
Really?
I would like people to hear each other.
I don't believe it.
Ask questions, like try to understand each other better so that we just don't make all those assumptions like you and I talked about earlier, because I think that's the place where EQ can be almost a savior. And I'd like to be able to wave the magic wand and say, just open your mind for a second and just hear this and try and see what you can do with it. And you might find this much of it that works for you or that makes a difference for you, but that might be all you need to make a turning point with a relationship.
David, you're creating ripples, my friend. You sure are. And I'm grateful that you took the time to be here. For those that are interested, that want to go deeper into their emotional intelligence journey and feel moved based on this conversation, my encouragement is to get your hands on Emotional Intelligence 2.0. Whether you get it through audio, whether you get it through a Kindle, or you get it in paper form, you will get access to the test. And it doesn't take a lifetime to do. There isn't 200 questions. Right. But the report you get, the insights are just phenomenal. And it's been a great little guiding tool, a compass for me on my journey. And how can we stay in touch? And I know you do monthly lives on LinkedIn. How can we find out more about you? And I'll make sure it's linked in the show notes.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can come, like, LinkedIn is a great place. I do a live show, but I also do some videos on there to try and just, educate people about what emotional intelligence is. Through TalentSmart, through our company. I mean, I'll share with you my email address. So if anybody has any additional questions, they can come through there as well. And I also want to thank you for this whole journey. Like, I love that you have a podcast that talks about this, that is going to serve people really well. And I bet you are changing people's lives without even hearing about it.
That's what we do, David. That's what we do. So, mate, absolute pleasure. Thank you for being here. And for those of you that joined us live or listening, thank you again. This is all possible because of you. And we're so grateful that you tune in, you work to apply these lessons that we gain from each of our guests. And just know, like, this for you was free. But the fee, if you got something out of this, is to share this with someone that could benefit from this conversation or could benefit from getting in touch with David or following his great work in TalentSmart EQ. So I want to thank you, the listener, that makes all this possible so that we can continue to prove that there is more than one way to be a man. What do you say, David? Do you think we did that today?
I think we did, Brandon.
Wonderful. Lots of love. We'll see you next week. This has been another episode of the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. We have been your host, Boyson Hodgson, and myself, Brandon Clift, and we want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. If you want to find out more about today's guests and support them in their mission, you can find links to them in the show notes. Now, if you have found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, we are always grateful for a rating and review of the show on iTunes. Now, above all else, we've got to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you have made it possible for us to let men all over the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if something in this episode has touched you, then perhaps it is the call to action to get involved in men's work. With live trainings happening constantly and in-person trainings happening all over the world, the Mankind Project definitely has something for you. Now, if you've enjoyed the music in this episode and all of our episodes, be sure to check out Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. And lastly, just know, what it means to me to be a man is completely different than what it means for you. That is the beauty of this journey. So if you are looking for guidance, support, and community as you begin to unpack and dive deeper into your men's work journey, then you know where to find us. Same place, same time, next week. Lots of love. We'll see you then.